Hi there, and welcome to the Surviving and Thriving in Residency podcast. I'm Charley Lowry, your host and director of GME Relations at PracticeLink. This show is all about exploring the world of graduate and undergraduate medical education. We'll dive into the real-life experiences, successes, and challenges faced by medical students, residents, and fellows, while also highlighting valuable tools to support you, whether that's financial planning, student aid, or the many free resources provided by PracticeLink. If you're thinking about med school, currently studying, or deep into residency or fellowship, this podcast is here to offer insights and support to make your journey a bit easier than those before you. Welcome back to another episode of Surviving and Thriving in Residency, brought to you by PracticeLink. I'm your host, Charley Lowry, and today's conversation is one I've been looking forward to. Our guest is someone who's become a powerful and honest voice in the world of medical training, Dr. Frances Mei Hardin. Dr. Hardin is a surgeon, writer, advocate, and the creator behind platforms like Rethinking Residency and Hippocratic Collective, where she champions physician well-being, storytelling, and systemic changes in the culture of medicine training. Her personal journey from surviving an intense residency to facing burnout and trauma to redefining her career on her own terms has resonated widely with trainees across the country. Today, she joins us to talk about the realities of residency, the emotional and mental cost of training, how to reclaim your identity as a human being in medicine, and how storytelling and community can help physicians not just survive, but actually thrive. Whether you're a medical student, an intern pushing through your first call month, or a resident trying to figure out what comes next, this conversation is for you. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Hardin. How are you today?
Thanks so much for having me, Charley. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing okay. So for our listeners who may not know you yet, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and what drew you into medicine and eventually to surgery?
My early life was fairly traditional, I think, for a pre-med, which is that I loved math and science early on. I came up in a STEM-heavy education. I went to a 3-year boarding high school, the Illinois Math and Science Academy, really even to further dedicate myself to the pursuit of a strong STEM foundation. And all along, my parents had only one child. I'm an only child. And both of them, they did have some of their own aspirations earlier in life to become physicians. Life got in the way. They felt very strongly that it would be wonderful to have a physician in the family. So, of course, that did fall squarely on me. When I graduated from the Illinois Math and Science Academy, I went to Notre Dame and I was a biochemistry major, which was wonderful. At that time, I was thinking either I'm going to go get a PhD in biochemistry and kind of go a pharma route, industry, or what ended up happening was that I, late on in the game, junior year, decided ultimately I want to be with people. I want to serve patients and their families directly, not work in industry or a lab or removed or anything. A medical ethics class taught by a physician priest at Notre Dame was a big part of that change of heart. And because I decided so late to ultimately apply to medical school, it led to taking the MCAT as a senior. I took one gap year and did ENT outcomes research in Missouri, and then I went straight into medical school from there. So that's just a little bit of, my background and how I got into it.
Wow. So only child. For me, that's a foreign concept because I am one of 12 children. Not that you need to know that, but totally different experience for me growing up, I'm sure. But tell me, what about the early parts of training? What was it like for you? Were there moments when you realized the reality of residency was different from what you expected?
Yes, I would say what was interesting is that even all these years later, and in hindsight, I connect with a lot of physicians where essentially, let's suspend disbelief or give the benefit of the doubt. I would say every physician I know has gone into this work because they truly wanted to serve people and connect with people and heal them, or at least, be with them if there's something that can't be healed. So that's why people go into it. But yet, even now, at the early, mid-career stages for attendings and things like that, that is just not the reality of the job or the experience. And when you look at when does the disillusionment occur with the job and the career, I see it happen at every stage along the way. So I do know of many people who struggled in medical school. Whether it was simply that it wasn't a good alignment or cultural fit, maybe there weren't a lot of resources or extra support at that particular learning institution, things like that. So some people, it's medical school. Some people, it's residency. And I'll dive deeper into my experience in residency because I would put myself in that resident bucket. But for instance, one of my colleagues had the best residency, or at least, neutral to best. And they weren't disillusioned by any means, but yet that extreme disillusionment happened in fellowship. For others, it's as an attending. They get through all the way of training, and then they're always told, okay, attending life will be heavenly. And then there's kind of a major mismatch and disillusionment there. So what I think is very interesting is the fact that many people do experience it. There's a lot of heterogeneity about where it happens along your pathway. For me specifically, what I can speak to is that I was blessed to have a really strong quality of education at every step up until residency. So I knew very much what it feels like when your teachers enjoy teaching, care about the learning experience, when the mentors really do invest in and care about the experience for the learner. Of course, residency is really tough, and residency falls in this place where on one hand, you're an employee, but on another hand, you are a trainee and a learner. There's a lot of competing interests. I felt that tension there in terms of even people who wanted to mentor, they don't necessarily get paid extra for that type of work. They practice full time, they operate, they have their own patients, and they have families, and they have all these competing interests. So there truly is this phenomenon where, at least when I speak to my own experience, there wasn't a lot of support for, or really, it felt like people looking out for residents. There weren't a lot of formal processes in place for protections for residents or anything like that.
Yeah. I talk to a lot of residents, and one of the key things we talk about is the first year of residency, what it's truly like and what a week looks like in residency. What about loneliness? What about burnout? What about diet? What about mind, body, and spirit? How do you keep all of that in check without things going off the rails in your first year of residency? Because it is a lot. It's a huge change from medical school to residency.
Absolutely. So for ENT, we do 6 months of ENT and then 6 months off service. So for me, my first year felt a lot like a continuation of almost later medical school clinical rotations, in that, for instance, July of my intern year, I showed up on vascular surgery. And that's a tough month. It was a tough rotation. But honestly, I would say what's interesting is that I agree with you. I think that maintaining any work-life balance, it's really hard on a rotation like vascular surgery because we're there at the crack of dawn. It's a small team. We had a decent patient census. And then I got home late after dark. So I don't feel that I necessarily had great work-life balance during that month. But what's interesting is you can always look at, I think that for things like quote-unquote burnout and how that's experienced by the trainee, a lot of us have different things that are more or less bothersome. And for me, interpersonal conflict, random bullying, things like that, it took up an inordinate amount of my mental bandwidth. Whereas honestly, spending 16 hours a day at the hospital, staying on my feet most of the day, not using the restroom for 12 hours, those things wear on me much less than, like I said, intimidation tactics, insults about appearance or background or education or family, things like that.
Yeah, which makes sense. I mean, that's taxing on your whole system.
It's funny because I just say this to acknowledge, for different people out there, different things will resonate with you. I know people where they do not mind. They do not mind the insults. It doesn't wear on them. And so that's why I just claim I know that about me. I know I'm not the only person. But I'm also aware there are a couple interesting cats out there where it literally in one ear, out the other, and more power to you. It does not stick to them.
Yeah. So one of your recurring messages is about the culture of medicine, of medical training. In your opinion, what are the most dangerous cultural norms in residency today?
I do think that even when we just spoke about burnout briefly, one thing that has been concerning to me over the past several years is that in these burnout conversations, often the onus for managing and mitigating the burnout is on the physician. And I think that these conversations that say, how are we going to make doctors more resilient, in the face of increasingly dysfunctional systems is not necessarily, the right answer. I think that a lot more being done on the system side to make the profession much more tenable is more of the answer. And the reason that I say that, the reason I call that out specifically is because going back to 99.9% of physicians that I've ever encountered in 15 years are extraordinarily resilient. That's actually probably how we got into a lot of these problems as autonomy and power has been siphoned away from the physicians and, of course, organized in other fashions. But the point being that doctors are agile. They will accommodate. They will take on more work. They will make it work. They are people who are adaptable and resilient. And so when extra tasks get gently, gradually assigned to them, they will just take those. And of course, in the US specifically, we're also dealing with a system where there's very little organization, no broad unionization. And so that's how I view some of these power dynamics have gotten out of whack.
Gotcha. You've talked about the pressure to be perfect and to never show weakness. How did that pressure shape your training experience?
Interestingly, I personally somewhat pushed back on that. So here's what I mean by that. The pressure to be perfect, especially in competitive surgical fields. There's a famous Dr. Betsy Grunch has called out from her early training, she received a document and it was called a primer, How to Swim with Sharks. And it was about the fact that if you show any weakness or a drop of blood, they'll attack you. So the fact that you can see there's even documentation floating around that endorses and perpetuates that kind of idea, that's very much what it feels like. I will say that when I got to my later training years, I started sharing, even just within my department, among my colleagues more openly. Hey, this happened in the operating room. This person was screaming and they really lost it. They did X, Y, and Z. And what was shocking about that is that when I shared that, not uncommonly, the other person would say to me, oh, that's happened to me too. That's happened to me multiple times. You're okay. To which I would say, this is crazy. This has happened to you before. This was earth-shattering to me. And you're saying it's happened to you multiple times. But there's this very real unwillingness to show any weakness. The thing that I think is important and what I'm trying to posit here is that I don't accept that me getting screamed at in the operating room for some time and then I cry, I don't accept that that's a story about my weakness. Because again, I'm actually very resilient and I've made it all the way here. And so what I would argue is that's a story about inadequate professionalism, teaching conditions, learning conditions. I think that that's a different story. And yet culturally, one of the reasons why it's gotten as bad as it has is because they've kind of convinced from a PR standpoint, it's the learner's fault and the learner is weak if something like that happens.
Yep, I can see that. So when you spoke to them and said this has happened to you before, what was their response? Was it more on the side of, oh, you'll get used to it kind of thing? Like when you said, you've been yelled at numerous times, what was their response?
Yeah, I think sadness, shame, just not willing to engage. And I respect that. So yeah, I would say it's just more of a self-protective mechanism, which is, hey, this has happened to me. I know it sucks. I definitely don't have a solution for it. Just try to squash it down. And then I see people actively trying to squash it down, sometimes not very successfully.
At PracticeLink, we believe your physician job search should be simple, supportive, and stress-free. That's why creating an account has always been, and will always be, completely free for physicians. Create your free account today at PracticeLink.com to start receiving your latest and most exclusive job opportunities directly to your inbox.
What signs of burnout do you wish trainees would recognize earlier?
Well, I think one that has always been interesting and stuck with me was that a phenomenon that happens to a lot of us is that you're sitting in clinic and maybe it's the afternoon and, midweek, and then when a patient no-shows, it's very common that people will celebrate that. And I've read that this has been identified as a potential early identifier of burnout. It's interesting because I agree. I think if you were talking to the 22-year-old bright-eyed, very hopeful person who's going into the medical profession, they would not celebrate a no-show. They'd say, hey, is my patient okay? I hope it wasn't a car accident. I hope they didn't fall ill or a family member didn't fall ill. Why aren't they here? That is not typically the process that happens in a system that, again, where the system wants to take advantage of these workers. The question is the worker burnt out, or is the system encouraging physicians to self-protect and armor up in this fashion? But yeah, the reality is a lot of people will celebrate, yay, when a no-show happens in clinic.
That's interesting. Yeah. So if a resident's listening right now and feels overwhelmed, what do you think the very first step should be that they might take?
So it may depend on what the etiology of the overwhelm is. I don't necessarily, in terms of kind of some blanket statement or advice, I do think that residency is temporary. That's very helpful. Some people just need to run out the clock in training, but that's only half the battle. Running out the clock being half the battle, and then the other half of the battle is taking care of oneself, nurturing oneself so that when you graduate from residency, you aren't a husk or shell of a person. Because I've seen that, I felt that in a way that's like more common than some of us would think. And I think that also, if I could say anything to all residents, I'd say you're doing a better job than you think. I think that the scarcity mindset in medicine, the fact that people often just are criticized or get kind of poor feedback, and we definitely don't do a lot to like build up these very smart, competent, hardworking people, that's part of why they feel so beaten down or like easily overwhelmed, or this feeling of like, well, I'm so inefficient. Everyone's telling me I'm inefficient. By definition, this person has to be much more efficient than the average individual because they've made it all the way here, right? And I don't think we do enough to ever stop, acknowledge, really celebrate that. We're always looking at the next goal.
Sure. I think it's hard too because there's not a lot of conversation. You take a lot home at the end of the day and you don't talk about it. I mean, there's not a lot of physicians, a lot of trainees sitting around just having these group chats where it's a safe space where you can talk about anything. And you're just taking that home at the end of the day for the most part.
Absolutely. And I've heard of a couple amazing programs in the country. I've heard of things like an EM program where those residents do go out for a drink after a shift and they decompress. And it is a safe space for exactly what you're describing. Hey, like I saw something really hard during this shift. Could I talk to a senior resident about it? And so I'm not saying it doesn't happen anywhere, but to me, the best goal is we need to bring the floor up for everyone. That's amazing when it happens, but so many people are without that type of construct. The other thing that I think is interesting and just wanted to call out really quickly is that the opposite can occur, which is especially, and of course, I come to this topic from an ENT background, but the phenomenon where you never really unplug, which is where you go home from the hospital. And so I'll speak personally. I would go home from the hospital and then be home for the evening, on call or not, and pretty much just ruminate on and perseverate about and complain about everything that happened that day, every person that was really nasty that day. And so it had this effect of I almost always was at the hospital and almost always experiencing like the very unpleasant sensations associated with that.
Oh, that's so tough. So you created Rethinking Residency. What inspired that? What do you hope to change about the experience of medical training?
Yeah, so Rethinking Residency, we made that 6 months after I graduated. I can tell you even now, I don't remember a lot of the first 6 months after I graduated. Kind of a blur. It took a long time to feel anything after graduating and leaving. But at about that 6-month mark, it was Christmas, New Year's season. And we really just wanted to distill down a lot of the helpful tips that got me through and just make a free resource online that would also be SEO'd. And this was all born from the inspiration that when I was a suicidal PGY4 resident and I was Googling resident physician suicide, resident physician depression, nothing was coming up. There was like one AMA handout. And the handout was like, go for a walk. If it's really bad, you got to call someone. I mean, it was so superficial. There was nothing out there. So what we wanted was to create a place where there were several different perspectives, just tons of different tips and tricks and things like that, which again would show up high on Google. And we accomplished that. So that was really just its own project. Certainly, it was great because I also learned a lot of discrete skills during that time. When we talk about, I didn't set out to learn these discrete skills, but this is how putting yourself out there, I think, can feed into other productive avenues, which is that I learned how to do digital marketing, make websites, do SEO. So I've been in that space for a couple years now, which has played into other areas that I now work in.
Yeah. You're doing a great job with it. That's for sure. Why do you think the medical system still struggles to address physician mental health effectively?
It's really tough. I think that there are entities that are trying and having some success. And I'll call out the Dr. Lorna Breen Heroes Foundation. Absolutely. Like what they've done to remove intrusive mental health questions from credentialing and things like that, state by state. I think that that's wonderful, and I do hope and want that to move the needle for people. But in terms of what isn't done correctly for physicians to address their mental health, I think there's so many obstacles, including that bigger players or players that have power in the healthcare system the way that it is in the US, I don't know that private equity is incentivized to care about physician mental health at all. And maybe I'm not seeing it. I always welcome being educated more on this, but certainly from a organizational dynamics standpoint, I just don't see a lot of incentive. Even if you take PE out of the picture, a lot of hospitals, rather than invest in physician mental health and mental well-being, they can just find other physicians. And I know it's expensive to replace a physician, but it is still being done at many places nationally. The other thing that I would say, and this is an area that I am trying to address, it's really difficult though. The physician mental health conversation has always been, prior to recently, just completely unwelcome. And then more recently, it's been okay, but a little bit secretive. Because what I find people really push back on is that they don't want patients to know. Like they don't want patients to find out or somehow hear that doctors are not thriving universally, like in the systems that we're currently in, right? Like the way that we come up in medical education and then the actual workforce we enter into. Physicians are just like burning out quickly. And you could even look at like EM retirement numbers and turnover and things like that. I'm just saying that as a broad statement. But particularly, I understand both sides of the coin because at a time where physician trust is relatively low, we don't want patients to not trust evidence-based medicine, but at the same time, having this conversation be limited to like a very secretive, even when I've shared various stories from the physician standpoint, I sometimes get private messages from doctors saying, you cannot say this publicly. You are the most dangerous thing about modern medicine today. I'll give an example of when I've created videos around the fact that I pivoted out of medicine. That was absolutely the right decision for me. I own it 100%. I'm happy about it. And when I say, for instance, it's very expensive to work a job that you hate, that was just an interesting observation because when I made a surgeon salary, I spent 1 billion times more than when I made a consultant salary, which is what I make now. I actually did have patients reply on that video, how dare you say that you hated being a doctor? That's dangerous. And there were a lot of doctors who responded to that person in kind and said, no, that doesn't mean that they're a bad doctor. And actually, a lot of doctors hate their jobs. I cared immensely about every single patient I ever had and their families and the interactions that I showed up to. And I actually think that like the record reflects that. And it's okay to also acknowledge that was not the right job for me. And I didn't like that job. That's okay. But there's this interesting lack of ability, I think, for there to be nuance or to have that conversation in public about the physician well-being because patients see that conversation about physician well-being and we don't want to scare them.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, from the general public, I think if they see weakness in a physician of any kind like that, they lose their trust, and that's not fair. I'm not sure why that works that way, how that ever really got started. I guess just because a doctor is a healer and people put their faith in them. It's a hard situation, right? I mean, that is a very, very difficult situation right there.
We probably run into kind of similar, it might be like the clergy problem, because agreed that like, yes, people in society put physicians up on a pedestal. But the thing is, here's the fallacy, because you say, okay, if a patient saw a weakness in their physician, then that might make them lose trust. The issue is that these problems are going on with physicians, whether or not the patient sees the weakness or not. So they might be feeling like, oh, this is the best doctor in the world. And guess what? That doctor is addicted to substances and abusing them. And frankly, dangerous. You just don't know it because this is a secret conversation. So that's kind of the fallacy of like, in fact, the tendency is that people who like speak openly and honestly about even some of their weaknesses, those are probably not even the most dangerous doctors. Whereas the dangerous ones would never say anything publicly. Their patients don't know. Their patients are like, I love this person. They're the best doctor. All the meanwhile, that physician is not doing well, abusing substances, frankly, dangerous or illegal activity, right? Like that's kind of the ironic piece of it. And that's also why I think this is so fragile right now.
It's a very, very tough, sad situation. You've been open about stepping away from traditional full-time clinical practice. Talk about that decision and what it meant for you as a surgeon.
Yeah, I had to decenter my identity as a surgeon to be able to survive that transition. You know, I think famously, surgeons especially are very egotistical and enmeshed with their jobs. And so I did do a lot of work for more than a year to be able to figure out how I can show up to places as just Frances Mei, a thoughtful person, a professional, all these other things, an artist, a writer, right? But just like not a surgeon. And I was previously for so many years, showing up places like, hi, I'm a surgeon. And here's all the impressive stuff that entails. And I had to really like shed and let go of all of that. What I will say is that my journey out of medicine, it makes perfect sense for me and to me. But I get people writing me a lot who say, did you think about like a different practice model? Or did you want to maybe switch specialties? And those are both very valid things that doctors will do. For me specifically, I'm also trying to show there is nothing wrong with saying, oh, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I don't want to practice any clinical medicine. I do think that interest in external validation and accomplishment and achievement unduly influenced me into a career path that was ultimately just not the right forever career for me. And there's nothing wrong with that, though. A lot of people bristle at that and then they're offended and they say you're attacking the institution of medicine. But yet I would argue that doctors, these like smart people, anyone who goes and trains and does all this and practices, we have the same rights as other brilliant professionals, which is that we can sometimes move around in industries. That is 100% okay. It is precedented, but a lot of the people I look up to who have done it, they did it very quietly, very, very quietly. Like you would not be able to really trace their journey. And understandably, they didn't want any of the backlash that comes with it. So they are happy as a clam in their new industry, but they never did it publicly. And I do think it's important for people to have the frame of reference that it can also be done publicly. And I actually think that the fact that I've done it in public and let people come out of the woodwork and attack and say this is some kind of like moral or character failure on the part of the person, and I just continue showing up and saying, no, I don't accept that. This is not a character failure. I'm allowed to contribute to society in whatever way I choose. And that's now like in a different industry. That's okay. No experience is wasted. I wouldn't be the competent expert that I am without all the experience of becoming a surgeon and practicing. So my hope is that the next time somebody does this, that it just goes more smoothly for them. Like this is how we normalize things and decrease the backlash sequentially. And not only that, but at the end of the day, this is like a life or death conversation because I know what it feels like to be stuck in medicine. And if it really, really, really does not fit and it becomes, I might want to end my life because I don't see another way out of this, I think it's so important that those people see there's tons of other ways out of this. I'm glad that I did not die in residency.
Yeah. You're definitely out there in the public and you're going to see that backlash no matter what. But the message that is great. And I think if you can help anybody in their journey, you're doing the right thing. What about a resident who maybe is afraid to admit that they're struggling or maybe thinking about pivoting? What would you say to them?
The 3 questions that I really love, and they changed my life. I learned these at a Korn Ferry leadership course. in my second year of being an attending. So I took a virtual course, and these 3 clarifying questions are: number 1, what do you want out of life? Number 2, why do you want it? And number 3, what are you willing to do or not do to get it? Shockingly simple, but I still have those saved on my desktop from back then and pasted up on my wall. And I actually do think that when somebody can answer those questions, and it might not be immediate, right? You just have to marinate on it a little bit, but that gives a lot of clarity. And so for a resident who's struggling, sometimes struggle is just part of training. And so if you're just struggling and then you have like a senior that you can reach out to and they can help you get through this tough time, that's wonderful. And then one day this will be a distant memory of struggling in residency, because that can encompass so much. But then there are people who maybe have a sneaking suspicion, like I did all the way back in residency. Oh, this just might not be the right job for me. I don't know that I even like it here or what this profession entails, and etc. I had that sneaking suspicion for many, many, many years before I even started to act on it at all. But in terms of people who want to pivot, I do think that being able to answer these questions, right? Because in terms of the pivot, like I'll give an example, which is that I was an ENT attending. So I had to say, what am I willing to do or not do to get it? I'm willing to take a significant pay cut to pivot and to find just a job that better aligns with my values and what I want out of life. What was interesting is that our moderator in the Korn Ferry group, we all shared our responses, and she said, I'm going to gently push back on you there. That's actually quite a limiting belief and mindset. Why can't you make as much, if not more, in a job that you love and that better aligns with your values? And so I think that that's great. I very much believe in growth mindset, and I love that she pushed back and kind of taught me that point, because it's still important that, number 1, I was willing to take a pay cut if necessary and for however long necessary. But I also think that second piece is really very wise as well. But in terms of pivoting, putting yourself out there, like I said, I probably had suspicions that this was not going to be it for at least 3 years before I made a LinkedIn. And most doctors don't have LinkedIn, and I loved not being on it, but that is how I started my year of yes and my year of networking, taking every single meeting, trying to cold call people and just figure out what was out there. I was doing all of that while working full time. I don't have a shortcut. I had a very smooth transition out of medicine into work that was already there for me, but that's because I've been working multiple jobs for a couple years now, and I don't know a shortcut around that. Otherwise, people can always, of course, leave medicine and then spend a few years building up their repertoire and then finding new work. But of course, there'd be like a pay lapse during that time.
Well, and something we didn't talk about is also those who may decide to pivot, who come from medical families, and the pressure of the family, how hard that would be as well. If your mother and father are physicians, maybe your grandparents are physicians as well, and it's something that's always been kind of pushed at you. That's a huge aspect too, the family pressure.
Interestingly, a lot of physicians I know, they would not recommend medicine to their children. And that may be somewhat a sign of the times, because I agree with you. And I've seen that, right? Where like people my generation have physician parents, but most people in my generation, they wouldn't recommend, because being a physician now is such a different profession than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Like that was actually a very different job. So what I will say is I believe I can speak on this, because in terms of the familial pressure, my family really wanted me to be a physician, and I was the first doctor in my family. Those are all like a big deal. And you could use that same logic to say, well, she can't walk away from this. But ultimately, when I was 32, 33 years old, I did all of this work, figured out what I wanted, and took that to my family and just said, I love you enormously. I'm so grateful for everything that you did to make it possible for me to be the professional that I am. And I said, but I lived for you for over 30 years, and I actually do need to live for myself for the next 30. That's certainly a very American type of thought process, especially because I'm half Chinese. So, I mean, culturally, that's a very American thought, but it's been wonderful. And my family has been very supportive. It obviously took a couple conversations to get to the understanding, but it very much is there. And My family's happier for me than ever because maybe they don't recognize me as like a happy person. It hasn't happened before in my adult life.
That's incredible. That's really great. So you're a writer, a storyteller, a creator. Why do you think narrative medicine is such a powerful tool for healing and connection?
I think because shame dies in the sunlight. And I think that shame is such a big part of the physician experience, and it's been making doctors very sick for a long time. And so to me, the writing experience, it's a beautiful way to heal our shame. And not only that, but when I personally share my writing journey, surgeons are stubborn. Doctors are stubborn. Surgeons are stubborn. You could not tell me anything. And when I committed to writing the book, I initially thought I was going to write a very different book from the one that has been written and that's about to be published. I sat down and I did my writer's group and I wrote for over a year. And my first 60,000 words, I brought them to my husband and he read it and he very lovingly said to me, it's impressive that you did it. We'll congratulate you. You did the feat. You have one manuscript here. Most of this is not true. And I was like, what are you talking about? And ultimately, so what it was is that for a lot of us, and again, high-achieving professionals, doctors, it's very easy for us to get lost in the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I had so many of these stories, many of them were not true. That's not deliberate at all. I would have told you, I care enormously about honesty. I couldn't see that they weren't true. And it took me writing in my own words, examining that, throwing that whole thing out to be able to come back to the table much more honestly and therefore create a book, my debut memoir, something I'm proud of. And some people, absolutely, they won't like the book or they don't like the literary nonfiction genre, but they can't say that this is a person who wasn't willing to go there and examine closely the different stories that they're telling themselves.
Yes. If you want to share, when will the book be released and what's the title of the book?
Absolutely. It's called Surgeon on the Edge. It will be out February 24th, 2026. It is already available for pre-order, so happy to send that link.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to know when to do what in your job search? First Practice, PracticeLink's resident and fellow career guide teaches you 10 easy-to-follow steps every prospective physician needs to find their dream practice. And best of all, it's completely free at firstpractice.com. Becoming a physician is hard. Finding a job doesn't have to be. Thank you for listening. Now we'll return to the podcast.
So a couple more questions for you before we wrap up here. The Hippocratic Collective, we haven't talked about that yet. And your podcast, you amplify physician voices. What stories do you feel are still missing from the conversation?
So many stories. And the reason I say that is because I think medicine has been platforming a very narrow range of physician stories for many decades. And I love that social media has certainly helped bring this about. But yeah, now we're truly, truly pushing the boundaries of what a traditional physician looks like. I was never that. Just inherently, just really like being a woman. I was never like the expected doctor to walk through the door. And certainly I even heard that in practice. So I think there's so many, like my mind can't even comprehend. These stories should be limitless. And I think like every single type and shape and experience of doctor is worth sharing. And that's something that we care very much about. And the reason that the Hippocratic Collective is a media company, we are a physician media company. And the reason is because we are like-minded people in that we wanted to improve the culture of medicine and medical education. And one way to more quickly affect change in culture is through media. Obviously, there's traditional ways, which is like go into academics, go into institutional change, and maybe 10 years later be able to see trickle-down effects. We wanted to go straight to the people in the system, straight to the media route, and that's what we've done. And while I say that we're like-minded people, what's awesome is that does not mean homogeneity of opinion or just like various stances. We are all very different people, and a collection of varying personalities just means that we have a better chance of the learner, the doctor, coming to our media company the way that they would go to The Ringer, for instance. finding a person who they get on with and they say, oh, okay, their show really resonates with me. I like this one doctor, so I go and visit sometimes.
We'll make sure that for our listeners to check out the Hippocratic Collective for sure. How can trainees build a supportive community even in toxic or high pressure training environments?
One of the most freeing lessons I learned during training, during residency, right? And there's a famous old saying, the lesson will repeat itself until you learn it. It is that you cannot change other people. I didn't understand that, certainly going into residency. I do feel that I walked out of residency with some understanding of it. So you can't change other people. So I am not trying to change the minds of maybe some more traditional or entrenched or malignant personalities. Like, that way lies madness, because I don't know of a way to change their minds or get a fully cooked adult to do a 180 on their personality. But what we can do is we can, number one, control ourselves, and just a reminder that you can control what you build in your life separate from a toxic work environment. In terms of magically transforming a toxic work environment into a non-toxic one, that I'm sure we could spend like a couple hours even trying to dig into that. And we might not always be successful in making that transformation occur. The inner transformation, that is 100% in our court. And so that can be daunting and freeing to like really sit with that. But also, number two, I'm very proud of the family that I built over the years, and that includes the family that I was building in residency and certainly things like that.
How about for our listeners who want to maybe express themselves a little more, writing, speaking, creating, but they feel scared? Do you have any advice for them? I think there's a lot of them out there on the verge of it.
Yes, and I think it's so worthwhile, and I think it's so important. And the really important message I want to get out there is like, of course, you can do it your own way. I almost think that because I happened to have left medicine and now I identify as an artist, I don't want people to conflate those things. And maybe they're thinking, wow, I'd love to like create in some little way or express myself, but I don't want to leave medicine. It's like, please don't. Those are almost unrelated things. So let's look at some great role models. I'll use the example, Dr. Laura Votter. She's an oncologist and she's academic. And she practices, like, she's such a wonderful example of a person who is a extremely engaged, productive clinical physician, an oncologist, and in addition, a writer, an artist. So she's carved out an incredibly unique career path. It has all of it. And so my advice to anyone would be, you get to decide. And you can say, alongside my clinical practice, there are so many different ways to still thoughtfully express yourself and create art. And I think it's very worthwhile. And I think it makes doctors better doctors, frankly. If I could mandate some kind of art and creative expression for doctors, I would.
Wow. So a couple of closing questions. What's something you wish you could tell your younger self on day one of residency?
I think hitting on this idea, you can't change other people, but you can fortify yourself. I do think that, interestingly, what I got wrong, especially as a junior resident, really up through senior resident, is that the unfairness that I saw in the system was so grating and distracting. And I spent a lot of time trying to say, like, hey, I just like to flag this. I think that this is so unjust. I think that this verbal abuse is so unacceptable and all these things. And I would say to that girl now, I'd be like, no, you only need to flag it like once or twice. At a certain point, it's understood and deliberate. You don't need to keep flagging it. You need to fortify yourself if you're going to choose to stay in that situation.
So how can trainees connect with you, follow your work, or get involved with Rethinking Residency or the Hippocratic Collective?
Well, always feel free to email me at francesmei@hippocratic-collective.com, FRANCESMEI. You can visit our website. We have a contact form at hippocratic-collective.com, and I'm on Instagram at Frances Mei MD and TikTok at Frances Mei MD. And always happy to connect. You know, at the Hippocratic Collective, we are open to any great ideas, specific pitches. We accept written submissions, and we have a bunch of great programs rolling out in 2026, including our Artist in Residence. We have our second ex vivo art magazine that will come out in the summer. And we also have internships as well.
It's amazing. I cannot thank you enough for being on the show today. And I would love to have you back. I think we could talk for days. Like you say, there's so much. This was very, very brief. And I would love to have you back sometime if you have the time.
Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Dr. Hardin, thank you for your honesty, your vulnerability, and your advocacy. Your story and the work you're doing now gives voice to so many trainees who feel unheard in our medical system. For our listeners, if today's conversation resonated with you, know that you're not alone. Residency is tough, but there are resources, communities, and people like Dr. Hardin pushing for a better, healthier future for trainees. If you want more support, tools, and conversations like this, follow the Surviving and Thriving in Residency podcast, powered by Practice Link. I'm your host, Charley Lowry, and thank you for joining us. And we'll be back with more stories and strategies to help you thrive, not just survive in training.